Welcome back, everybody, to the Get At It podcast series, The Hard Questions, here on YouTube, Rumble, and Instagram, and TikTok. Thank you, everybody who's been watching the videos and sharing them and liking them and leaving comments. I can't tell you how good it makes you feel that when people respond to the stuff that you're doing, especially when you know that the stuff you're doing, even though it's a little bit outside of your purview normally, it's something good. So thank you for responding and being engaged. It means a whole lot. So with that, we're gonna get into week one, the problem with evil, or the problem of evil, and we have a couple of things that we need to explore as it relates to evil. First, we need to define it. We need to figure out what it is, and then we need to figure out where it comes from, because it's going to be necessary to identify where it comes from if we're going to answer someone who is asking about why something is, but doesn't have a frame of reference, a universal frame of reference for why that thing is what it is. So I'll start with the definition, and again, I'm kind of working from notes, so bear with me. The biblical definition, all right, a biblical definition built around several verses that kind of explain what evil is, right? And it's everything from evil being the changing what is to what is not, right? Substituting good for evil, calling good evil and evil good, calling bitter sweet, sweet bitter, etc. Obviously, because that becomes based on universal morality, those claims become a lie, which is an affront and a rebellion towards God, which is the whole origins of sin thing, right? So with that, we define it. Well, I'm going to define it. As fundamentally defined as the departure from God and His standards, manifesting as rebellion against God and harm towards others, right? And it's pretty general, and I think it covers pretty much anything that you could want as it relates to being comparable to good, right? And what does this mean when someone asks, why would you worship a God that does evil things, right? Or that not even that does evil things. Why would you worship a God that allows evil to happen or created evil, right? And that's three very different approaches, right? You have someone who believes that God executes evil on people. You have someone who believes God allows evil on people, and you have a person who believes that God created that evil, right? And sometimes they'll believe all three. Now, the only one that's even close is the one God permits it, right? Because, and we'll look a little bit later if we can get into it, the sovereignty of God through suffering, right? It's kind of esoteric, and it's kind of long-winded when you get into the whole milieu of it, but it makes sense, right? So if we define evil as fundamentally a departure from God and His standards, right? That means that the standard for evil is only subject to Him who created it, right? So if we have an objective standard for what evil is, right, by virtue of a biblical definition, because obviously our worldview is going to be defending the Christian precepts, lessons, teachings, etc. So if we identify our definition of evil as being universally attributable to and only attributable to the one God, right? We have a platform from which to build, right? Build our case, right? Because we have to understand as Christians that evil was not a design, right? It was not God's intention. In Genesis, He gives a very fair warning, and he really makes the first charge of humanity in obedience, right? He tells Adam, don't eat of those trees. Don't do it. Those two in the middle, don't do it. Don't eat them. If you do, he gives a consequence. If you do, you will surely die. Right? So we have the first opportunity for humanity, God's creation, humanity, to turn against him or rebel against him with the advent of free will, right? And I think in my personal, I don't want to say personal interpretation, but the way that I see things and read things, which could be wrong. I'm a lifelong study, so if you have a comment, please, by all means. Um, the way the way I kind of see it is the free will was not realized until Eve was enticed, right? Shiny, sweet, nice apple, right? Go for it. And once that act happened, once that, we'll call it once that pathway was connected, right? Where we realize that free will is ours, and hence humanity falls because we can now choose to be disobedient because the first two humans chose to be disobedient. The presence of evil is not a design by God for them to be disobedient. It is a result of their willingness to be disobedient, even though they know there are consequences for being disobedient. So when we look at it that way, we can. It doesn't. And I'm going to be real honest. This is not going to 100% smash the God didn't create evil thing, because there is some philosophical jest that you can kind of go back and forth on as to, well, if he created everything, and it exists, then he created it. Well, yeah, but no, right? Creating an environment where a creation can choose to love its creator, right, is not creating evil. It is creating an environment, right? It's like saying that a scientist who's growing something in a petri dish, right, created the molecular response, right, or created the environmental response of whatever it is that he's growing, right? He didn't create the reaction, right? He created the environment, right, for the reaction to occur. Whether or not the reaction would occur, he didn't necessarily know, right? Got a good guess, but even if he did know, he still didn't make the reaction happen. The reaction was going to happen whether or not there was an influence once the environment was set, if that makes any sense. And that might be way into the weeds, and if you want, I'll kind of flesh that out later on. But nonetheless, the creation of an environment where things can happen is not necessarily the same as creating the individual decisions of those who are acting in a way to affect those things around them. So that's where I leave that one. And then there's a couple of different versions, obviously, when turning away from God's knowledge. When I think it was Romans, and he's basically talking about turning away. They couldn't be bothered to keep God's knowledge, so because they didn't keep God's knowledge, and eventually it left them, so therefore they are open to the things, the temptations and the passions of the flesh to come over and overtake that focus that's supposed to be on God, that biblical focus that's supposed to be from humanity to God, right? What was the last one? The last one. Nonetheless, but I'll put some of these notes up if you guys want access to this stuff. I'll let you kind of see where my notes are. And here's kind of how the approach has to work, right? Because we understand that God creating the environment for evil does not equate to God creating evil, because evil is a creation of disobedience to him. Now, if we even remove all of that, right, which is where a lot of these conversations will start. If we remove even all of that little piece of theology, and we pose the question back, okay, so someone says, God created evil, or God, allows evil, or whatever it is. Why would you worship a God that does that? If we pose the question back to them, just kind of reconnoitering it, right? Kind of, and a lot of this is going to be uncomfortable because it's holding people accountable to their worldview, which can be kind of hairy. But if you approach it again, gentleness, respect, I think it can be done where you'll actually have a chance to at least open somebody's mind, if not change it. So, because they are using a concept that was created by God in order to judge God, right? We have to assume that God, right, that God is the creator of the environment where it can exist. Darn it, stop it, right? If you remove faith in God or belief in God, does that mean that you remove evil, right? Obviously not. Whether or not a person does or does not believe that God exists does not remove evil from the world. It only provides it only serves to act as a reason for an excuse to not deal with it, right? Because as Christians, we're told to deal with the evil, right, within us, right? We have to wring out our hearts. We literally have to create an environment where we suffer actively in order to get all this stuff out of us, like with fasting, right? It's an extremely powerful tool in finding what it is that's important in your life, especially when it relates to what it is you think God thinks is important in your life, right? Having said that, right? Nonetheless, if we are having a conversation about evil and we eliminate a belief in the entity or the whatever you want to call it, we'll call it God, obviously. If we eliminate a belief in God who created the environment for everything to happen, right? Where is it, upon what like morality principle is an argument based that questions whether or not God is or is not evil, right? And a lot of times what that argument boils down to is a cherry-picked reading, oftentimes, of the Old Testament, where God commands the Jews to wipe out, and it says very clearly, wipe out, in no uncertain terms, right? Men, women, children, goats, yada yada yada, very specifically. Now, and we'll get it, and there's a discussion to be had on the language used versus what actually happened, because all the people that Israelites were supposed to wipe out, they didn't wipe out, because there's evidence of them later on down, hundreds and hundreds of years later, remnants of their population that are still intermingling with Israelite society, etc. Anyway, we have to understand the purpose for why God wanted that to be done, right? Why he asked the Jews to do it, because he gives very clear language as to why he wants this to happen. And we also have to judge against what he ultimately, the environment that he created, him being the creator of all things. If he deems it to be necessary to judge a people, and we'll take the Amalekites specifically, right? This is the one that a lot of people will kind of harp on, because it's a very clear picture of it's a very easy one to latch on to, right, if you take it out of context, right? So the Amalekites in Exodus attacked the Israelites as they were coming out of Egypt from slavery. They had nothing. They were unprotected. They had no place to go. They were literally camping in the wilderness for 40 years, blah, blah, blah. Amalekites came and attacked them and messed them up pretty good, right? So God pushed Amalekites back, obviously, throughout the story, brought the Israelites into the land of Canaan, and made a charge to Israel to remember what the Amalekites had done. And by the time everything was said and done, now it's Saul's turn to be the first chosen king or anointed king of Israel. And God says, remember Amalekites, go get them. And Saul doesn't do what God wanted him to do, or at least as thoroughly as God wanted him to do it. And as a result, right? As a result, Saul loses everything. Saul loses everything because he did not exact God's justice on the people whom had exacted injustice against God's people, right? So Saul lost his life, lost his kids, actually committed suicide in battle. He got struck with a whole bunch of arrows and was begging his assistant guy to, hey, you got to kill me, dude. You got to kill me. And his assistant was like, I'm scared because this God thing. So Saul said, okay, I'll do it myself, and ran himself through, right? So that's how Saul's kingdom ended as we move in, as the story moves into David, right? As history moves through into David. So it's not, we can't call God judging the Amalekites and utilizing the Jews to judge them evil especially if we are accepting of the objective morality that what the Amalekites did was bad and was indeed punishable, because it quite frankly was. It was pretty nasty. If you read through the wilderness story and what happened with the Amalekites, it was really nasty. It's not real long, but it's real graphic, right? So if you are to say that what God did to the Amalekites is evil, well, based on what? Based on what philosophy or principle or set of values, morals, right? Can you judge God's judgment on people who were deserving of judgment to be evil, right? And in the same way that God used the Israelites to judge the Amalekites, he also used the Babylonians and the Assyrians to judge the Jews. When the Jews were not doing what they were supposed to do, which this, again, these are really graphic stories, and a lot of people aren't familiar with these graphic stories, which is why it's easy for them to just kind of cherry pick them, right? Because they don't know the actual depth of depravity that the Israelites were undertaking as it related to their intermingling with other cultures that were left behind after they were supposed to be wiped out, yada, 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 right? The Canaanites and the Perizzites and the Hittites, etc., right? Worshipping multiple gods, which is first thing that God said to Moses, don't do it, right? We got two first things. God said, Adam, don't eat that tree, don't eat the fruit, or you'll die. And sure enough, he messed it up, right? God said to Moses, tell these people there's only one God and it's just me, and if they worship other gods, it's going to be trouble, right? The first thing he said, and usually the first thing that I shouldn't say that. That's another conversation. But usually one of the first things that the Israelites would do was start adopting the gods and the practices of worshiping those gods of the people whom they were living near, right, or doing commerce with or interacting with on whatever level, right? So God actually used the people who were tempting the Israelites to judge them, right? Said, I'll if you want to turn your back on me, I'll let you. And that's the whole crux of it. If you want to turn your back on me, I will let you turn your back on me. But understand that when I turn my back, you know what I mean? I'm going to come and fulfill the covenant, but you're not going to like the way I do it because it's my covenant with you, not your covenant with me. You know what I mean? If that makes sense, which might be a little ill-spoken, but nonetheless, you kind of get where I'm going. So the problem of evil is not that evil exists, or even that God created it or the environment for it. The problem of evil for people who are asking questions as to why you would worship a God that does evil, right? We have to figure out what it is that they're considering to be evil and why they're considering it to be evil, right? We have to establish their definition of what evil is and where the origin concept comes from. Because if we have and I've heard this discussion before. I've heard evolutionary psychology, because if we do nice things for other people, they do nice things for us, and evolution states that those kind of characteristics, because they are advantageous to the propagation of the species, will naturally just encode themselves in us, right? Which, I mean, kind of plausible, maybe a little bit, but not really when you take into consideration the fact that morality, right? The concept of evil and good, the concept of moral and immoral as a universal a universal precept or a universally applicable only to God. Morality is not dependent on evolution, right? Morality exists independent of an evolutionary need for it, right? So that means the origins of morality are pre-evolutionary, like triggers, which you know, I don't want to say negates their argument, but it kind of negates their argument. If you're going to use a subjective view of morality, then anybody can do anything anytime they want to anyone for any reason, right? Because it's all subjective. There can't be a universally subjective morality. That's the whole point of the word subjective, if that makes sense. Moving on. Problem amiable. And here's the other side of it. So you're faced with the fact that evil exists, and you have one of two ways of approaching it. You can either approach it in the Word and understand how to identify it, how to deal with it, right, or cope with it, and how to defeat it, right? Or you can choose to just stare at it and hope it goes away, because essentially that's what you're doing, unless you're actually proactively spending your time and resources and energy on doing something for it, which I commend you if that's the case. But in that, why is it good, or again, what makes it morally good for you to work towards that, right? So it's this kind of delicate balance of reason and logic versus belief. But we have to understand that because morality exists independent of scientific whatever, right? It has to be it has to have a universal source. And if we don't identify the universal source, what we have is what we had in Nazi Germany in the 1940s. What we have is Pol Pot, right? We have North Korea now. We have China now, right? That's what we have. If we subject the definition of morality to someone who doesn't understand the universal source of morality, then we leave open to interpretation that someone can extinguish the flame of somebody else for the greater good of someone whom they don't know. That's where we have to draw the line. That's where we have to draw the line as it relates to how we interact with one another on a governance level. But that's we'll talk about that later. And in that, right? And in that, God gives us His Word as a source of peace. And again, if we learn to identify it, we learn to identify it. We learn to identify where it comes from. We learn how to close the door to it, how to defeat it if it does get in, right? If we have a document or some kind of blueprint where we can look at this and say, oh, that's how I deal with it, I think that's a whole lot better than watching it happen and then questioning a God you don't believe in as to why it happened, and then not accepting that you're borrowing His morality to judge what's going on as a result of other people's turning away from or being rebellious to God, which manifests itself obviously as harm to others, right? And if we approach it like that, again, you have to kind of hold people's feet to the fire when it relates to making them look at logic. It's going to be uncomfortable sometimes. It's going to be uncomfortable, but you have to remember, if we're going to win souls, if we are going to draw people to the good side, right? And I stole this from my pastor here in Texas, Pastor Chuck. On Sunday, he said it's not about politics. It's not about left and right or any of that stuff. It's about good and evil, right? And our job is to win as many people over to the good side, so that there's not anyone left on the bad side, on the evil side, right? That's our goal. Will we achieve it? Eventually he will. Sure. Are we going to achieve it in our lifetime? Maybe it'll come. I don't know. But because I believe what I say I believe, and because I care enough about people, about people and what the implications of living a life that is outside of that universal morality, so to speak, right? I know how dangerous it is. I know how sick it makes people, and I'm not talking metaphysical. It makes your soul sick. No, it makes you physically sick. If you have not yet seen the life of Charlie Sheen, right? I encourage you to watch how sick that life can make you, how sick rebelling and turning your face away from, right? How sick and ugly and bad it can make your life and your situations in your life. And I care that people don't go through that, because I've been through it. I've fought with addiction. I've on more than one occasion, right? I've beaten it, thank God, but it ain't because of me, right? But I know how miserable I was. And I know how miserable everybody else around me was. And maybe I just have this, natural empathy in me where I don't want to cause people harm or whatever. But I choose to believe, because I know it to be true, that empathy in me is what makes service to others easy. And when I stop serving me, right, and I start approaching what it is that I'm doing with helping others, and this is what this is about. I don't care what happens with this channel other than somebody gets something good out of it, right? The problem of evil is not that evil exists. The problem of evil is that we don't understand that it comes from inside us. When we choose to be disobedient, when we choose to not focus on His will and instead try to make our lives and the things in our lives our will, when we try to do that, it is evil. There is no difference to God in the size of your sin. There is no difference to God in the size of your sin. Disobedience is disobedience. If you're unaliving someone, you're being disobedient to the precepts that you should love your neighbor as you love yourself, right? In the same way, if you are choosing to disregard the universal morality that God has written into our DNA beyond what evolution could even hope to achieve, by being disobedient to that, we are committing the same evil. It is being disobedient in either case. And I think a lot of times what happens is we get too bogged down in what is the graphicness of what evil is nowadays, right? Profound evil, profound immorality, right? Where it's horror movie style descriptions of things. And yes, that stuff is evil. Doing that to another human being is evil. But lying to your Creator is not as evil. I find that hard to believe. We have to be honest in ourselves. We have to be honest in ourselves and understanding that the evil that exists in the world exists because free will allows people to turn their face away from God. And with that, we'll bring this episode to an end. Guys, thank you so much. I really appreciate you sticking around and listening. I appreciate you letting me occupy some of your headspace. We'll try to bring you good quality content as the weeks go by, and expose more of these concepts and some of the ways to address them with people, so you can take it in the world with you and try to do your part, I guess, in the same way. So as always, be helpful, be a leader, learn smart stuff, and if you can be here for this stuff, get here.